we overlook about Birth of a Nation was that it was also a tremendously accurate prediction of the way in which race would operate in the United States. Birth of a Nation was almost directly responsible for the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. It had received this romantic, glowing, heroic portrait. The Klan never had the ritual of burning the cross. That was something that D.W. Griffith came up with because he thought that it was a great cinematic image. So it was literally an instance of life imitating art.
The ripples emanate far out from just the simple fact that it's a movie and in the early motion picture age.
With the tremendous burst of popularity that the Ku Klux Klan had as a result of Birth of a Nation came another wave of terrorism.
We had lynchings in this country between Reconstruction and World War II. Thousands of African Americans murdered by mobs on the idea that they had done something criminal.
At the National Democratic Convention in New York in 1924, it is estimated that at least 350 delegates were Klansmen.
Demographic geography of this country was shaped by that era. We have African Americans in Los Angeles and Oakland and Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit, Boston, New York, and very few people appreciate that the African Americans in those communities did not go there as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went there as refugees from terror.
We didn't just land in Oakland, in LA, in Compton, in Harlem, in Brownsville in 2015. This is generational trauma.
The letters KKK were carved with a penknife on the chest and stomach of this man in Houston, Texas, after he had been hanged by his knees from an oak tree and flogged with a chain.
The Chicago Negro boy, Emmett Till, is alleged to have paid unwelcome attention to Roy Bryant's most attractive wife.
And then when it became unacceptable to engage in that kind of open terrorism, then it shifted to something more legal: segregation, Jim Crow.
Laws were passed that relegated African Americans to a permanent second-class status.
These things really begin to live out the prophecy that Griffith was making about the way that race operates. And this fear of crime is central to all of this.
Every time you saw a sign that said white in color, every time you had to deal with the indignation of being told you can't go through the front door, every day you weren't allowed to vote, every day you weren't allowed to go to school, you were bearing a burden that was injurious.
Civil rights activists began to see the necessity of building not just a civil rights movement, but a human rights movement.
And I think we should start now preparing for the inevitable. And let us, when that moment comes, go into the situations that we confront with a great deal of dignity, sanity, and reasonableness.
They want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, out of which will come a conglomerated, not a mongrel class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement. We just got to put here on this end that the students are in.
Those were trying to integrate the bathing beaches, and the Florida Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission warned that the city was becoming a racial super bomb with a short fuse.
Civil rights activists began to be portrayed in the media and among many politicians as criminals, people who were deliberately violating the law, segregation laws that existed in the South.
For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. Justice too long delayed is justice denied.
I think that one of the most brilliant tactics of the civil rights movement was its transformation of the notion of criminality. Because for the first time, being arrested was a noble thing. Being arrested white people was your worst nightmare. Still is, for many African Americans. So what they did, they voluntarily defined a movement around getting arrested. They turned it on its head.
If you look at the history of black people's various struggles in this country, the connecting themes is the attempt to be understood as full, complicated human beings. We are something other than this visceral image of criminality and menace and threat to which people associate with us.
You're going to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. Let us lay aside irrelevant differences and make our nation whole.
Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, said finally, we admit it. Though slavery ended in December 1865, we took away these people's rights, and now we're going to fix it.
For the first time, the promise of, equal justice becomes at least a possibility.
Their cause must be our cause, too.
Unfortunately, at the very same time that the civil rights movement was gaining steam, crime rates were beginning to rise in this country.
Crime was increasing, and the baby boom generation that had emerged immediately after World War II, now they were adults. So just through sheer demographic change, we had an increase in the amount of crime.
And became very easy for politicians then to say that the civil rights movement itself was contributing to rising crime rates, and that if we were to give the Negroes their freedom, then we would be repaid as a nation with crime.
The prison population in the United States was largely flat throughout most of the 20th century. It didn't go up a lot, it didn't come down a lot. But that changed in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we began an era which has been defined by this term, mass incarceration.
This is a nation of laws, and as Abraham Lincoln has said, no one is above the law, no one is below the law, and we're going to enforce the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law. A beginning in which courses are set that shape decades or centuries. This can be such a moment.
It's with the Nixon era and the law and order period when crime begins to stand in for race.
If there is one area where the word war is appropriate, it is in the fight against crime.
Part of what he talked about was a war on crime, but that was one of those code words, what we might call dog whistle politics now, which really was referring to the black political movements of the day, Black Power, Black Panthers, the anti-war movements for women's liberation and gay liberation at that time, which Nixon felt compelled to fight back against.
Once the federal government, through the FBI, moves into an area, this should be warning to those who engage in these acts that they eventually are going to be apprehended.
There's this outcry for law and order, and Nixon becomes a person who articulates that perfectly.
There can be no progress in America without respect for law.
Many people felt like we were losing control.
We need total war in the United States against the evils that we see in our cities.
Federal spending for local law enforcement will double. Time is running out for the merchants of crime and corruption in American society. The wave of crime is not going to be the wave of the future in the United States of America. We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.